Today, we're jumping into a really tough but super important conversation. It's a dialogue between Sam Harris, who you probably know as a major critic of religion, and Maajid Nawaz, a former Islamist who's now a leading liberal reformer. And they're tackling a massive question. Can Islam find its place in a modern, open society? Let's get into it. So, where do you even start with a topic this big? Well, they started with a single question. A really challenging, high-stakes question that kind of cuts right to the heart of the entire debate. So this is what Sam Harris asked Maajid Nawaz the very first time they met. And you can see how it just perfectly frames the tension, right? He's basically asking, is this whole project of Islamic reform an honest one? Or do reformers have to, look the other way, creatively reinterpret some of the faith's most violent and difficult parts? But Nawaz, he pushes back hard with this really powerful idea. He says, look, no scripture, none, just speaks for itself. It doesn't matter what text it is. Its meaning is defined by the people who follow it. And since the huge majority of Muslims today aren't violent, he says that Islam in practice right now is a religion of peace. Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we have to be clear about the words we're using. These terms get thrown around all the time, and it can get confusing. But Nawaz gives us some really crucial definitions that help us figure out who exactly we're talking about. First up, Islamism. Now, the key thing to get here is that this is not about someone's personal faith. This isn't about praying or going to a mosque. Islamism is a political project. It's the specific goal of taking one interpretation of Islam and forcing it on everybody, usually as a law of the land. And then you have jihadism. The easiest way to think about this is as the armed wing of Islamism. These are the people who use violence and force to achieve that political goal. So here's the takeaway. All jihadists are Islamists, but not every Islamist believes in using violence to get what they want. And this chart, wow, it just lays it out so clearly. This is Nawaz's model. At the very center, that tiny core, you've got the jihadists, but see how they're surrounded by that bigger group of Islamists? They might not be violent, but they share a similar political goal. And then beyond them, you've got the largest group by far, conservative Muslims who might hold traditional beliefs but aren't trying to impose them on anyone else. So how many people are we talking about in that Islamist circle? Out of 1.6 billion Muslims worldwide, what percentage are we looking at? Well, based on decades of polling and election results, both Harris and Nawaz actually agree on this. They estimate it's a pretty significant minority, somewhere between 15 and 25%. So that begs the question, right? How does someone end up in those inner circles? How does that radicalization process actually work? And honestly, there's no better way to understand this than to look at Maajid Nawaz's own story. It's an incredibly powerful case study. I mean, his journey is just staggering. As a teenager in the UK, he was the victim of these vicious, violent, racist attacks. That experience pushed him to join a global Islamist group, and he got so good at it, he became a top recruiter. That work eventually got him thrown into a political prison in Egypt. But that's where everything changed. Through conversations and with help from groups like Amnesty International, he began this incredible transformation, from a hardcore extremist to a leading voice for liberal reform. And from that whole experience, Nawaz identifies this kind of four-part formula for how people get recruited. He says that grievances, things like racism or foreign policy, they're just the spark, they're a catalyst. They prey on a young person who's already having some kind of identity crisis. But the real key, the thing that turns that grievance into a weapon, is the ideological dogma delivered by a charismatic recruiter who gives them a whole new, all-encompassing worldview. Okay, so even when people find a way out of extremism, there are still huge roadblocks to reform. And here's where Nawaz points his finger at a really unexpected and, frankly, controversial source, something he calls a betrayal by liberals themselves. He argues that some Western liberals, with the best of intentions, have ended up practicing a kind of reverse racism. He says, in the name of being culturally sensitive, they refuse to call out the reactionary, illiberal parts of some Muslim communities. And the devastating effect of that, he says, is that it silences the very reformers, people like him, who are fighting for change from the inside. And this really gets to the core of it. Classical liberalism is all about the individual and universal human rights for everyone, period. But what he calls regressive leftism focuses more on the group. It ends up abandoning those universal values for a kind of cultural relativism that, ironically, hurts the most vulnerable people in those communities. We're talking women, gay Muslims, apostates, you name it. Now, Sam Harris throws another major obstacle into the mix. He argues that trying to be a moderate or a reformer often requires some serious mental gymnastics. And the powerful magnetic pull of fundamentalism is that it can claim to be the most simple, the most honest, the most literal reading of the scripture. And that straightforward reading often leads, well, directly to extremism. So, you've got all these massive challenges, from the holy texts themselves to the political climate. What on earth is the path forward? Well, Nawaz proposes a solution that is both radical and, in a way, incredibly simple. It's all about a shift in perspective. The whole solution, according to Nawaz, boils down to championing one profound idea that's actually rooted in Islamic tradition. It's the concept of ijtihad, basically human interpretation. The idea is simple. Every reading of a holy book is just that, a human interpretation. And if no single person can claim to have God's one and only true meaning, then no one gets to justify forcing their interpretation on others. And this just illustrates the chain reaction perfectly. It's like a set of dominoes. Once you accept that there's no single correct way to read the scripture, that immediately opens the door to pluralism, the idea that many different views can coexist. And pluralism is what you need to build a secular state. And a secular state is the best system we've got for protecting democracy and, ultimately, universal human rights for every single person. But this brings us all the way back around, right back to that central tension that kicked this whole thing off. And it leaves us with this final critical question to think about. Is just promoting the freedom to interpret the text enough to reform a faith? Or are some doctrines, some specific passages, just so clear, so unyielding, that they'll always resist being reinterpreted and will always be a source of fuel for extremism? That's the challenge they leave us with.